This video is sponsored by Skillshare. No part of a story is as tense or interesting as its climax. And at least by my preference, there is nothing like a narrative climax in the form of an epic fight. It really is a tried and true formula as old as time, but when it works, it really works. This is one of the reasons that the fight between Aang and Ozai was one of the greatest moments of my childhood. I remember watching it with sheer awe and amazement, pretty much slack-jawed at how cool everything was. But now that I've watched it again as an adult, I am still amazed by the fight, but for completely different reasons. My love of the scene now stems from how masterfully done the writing was. And that might seem like a weird thing to say, due to the fact that the whole confrontation is just a straightforward fight with no obvious narrative bells or whistles. But that appearance of nothing special being there is specifically why I'm so impressed with the fight. This line from Futurama sums up my thoughts pretty well.
When you do things right, people won't be sure you've done anything at all.
This fight between Aang and Ozai appears simple, but there is so much that could have gone wrong. The writers had to juggle so many balls and coordinate so many moving pieces for this final climactic battle to hit home like it needed to. And more or less, they perfectly did it, and all without using hardly any dialogue. For the rest of this video, I want to take a look at this fight and break down the writing choices within. For anyone new to the channel, since my day job is being an editor for novels, scripts, and manuscripts, I've noticed some writing details within the construction of the scene that might otherwise go unnoticed. My hope is that this video would be a help for all you writers out there who are trying to devise your own climactic battle scenes. Or it could just be a cool inside look for all you Avatar fans out there. So here is the game plan of how this video will go. We are going to watch the scenes from the fight together, and when something of interest happens, I will break down the writing behind it. Sadly, we won't be able to watch the entirety of the fight because Nickelodeon has a stranglehold on this scene and isn't allowing anyone to use more than 30 seconds of footage at a time. Still though, for the purposes of this breakdown, that should be plenty, and if you want to watch the full uncut scene before we flip open the hood, the link will be in the description below. If you are still sticking around though, let's get right into it. So, aside from Ozai's blast of fire being amazing to behold, it actually accomplishes a pretty significant narrative function. It sets the tone of the scene, and it does it in three ways. Like almost all great scenes, this fight between Aang and Ozai is set up in a 3-act structure. We have an introduction, a midsection with rising action, and a climax with a resolution. This fight essentially tells a whole narrative, and that narrative is conveyed almost completely through physical conflict. As it avoids dialogue, this fight would fall into the category of visual storytelling, and if this fight were written in a book, it would be considered descriptive storytelling. This all relates to Ozai's blast of fire because the attack keeps with the storytelling theme of the rest of the scene. It's visual, it provides information about the narrative by showing you. The writers could have easily chosen to make Ozai deliver dialogue to present information to the audience. He could have said, because of Sozin's comet, my bending has been increased to a point where I can fell mountains and churn the ground with flames. But as far as I'm concerned, the reason they specifically didn't do that is because telling the audience how powerful Ozai became is nowhere near as impactful as showing it. And again, showing his power runs in line with the tone of the visual storytelling style that the ensuing fight demands. But Ozai's blast of fire also sets the tone for his antagonism. A general rule of writing is that an antagonist is only as effective as the conflict that they bring to the narrative. The greater the obstacle the antagonist is, the higher the stakes of the conflict. Ozai's blast of fire at the very beginning of this fight is meant to show how monumentally dangerous he is as an antagonist, and how great of a challenge Aang will face to overcome him. The blast of fire coats the rest of the fight in a tone of doom and anxiety. And just so you know I'm not making this stuff up as I go along, this technique of showing the threat of an antagonist at the beginning of a narrative to set a tone is decades, if not centuries old. The very beginning of Jaws, released in 1975, shows the threat of a killer shark, and that tone permeates the rest of the film. More recent movies to have also used this technique are The Dark Knight and Infinity War. The Dark Knight sets the tone of the Joker's threat by showing his elaborate bank heist. Infinity War sets the tone of Thanos' threat by showing him spanking Hulk like a child. Getting back to Ozai, the third and last way that Ozai's blast of fire sets the tone is by validating him as the central antagonist of the series. All throughout Avatar, the Fire Lord was built up as an existential threat to the rest of the world. 3 seasons worth of hype made it imperative that the Fire Lord be the greatest threat that Aang had ever faced. Ozai's initial attack is a feat of firebending the likes of which we've never seen before, and its sheer overwhelming power validates Ozai's status as the focus of all of the conflict of this fantastic series. While the last clip established Ozai's threat and power through visual storytelling, it was just as important to do the same thing for Aang. On a narrative level, Aang single-handedly taking down Ozai's flagship is meant to show his ability as the protagonist to oppose and rise above the conflict that the antagonist brings. Again, more than anything else, Aang's actions here set a tone. The audience will now have seen 2 incredible feats of bending from both the protagonist and the antagonist. These actions have set the stage and the bar for what the audience should expect from this climactic fight scene, and a good build-up to a fight is almost as important as the fight itself.
After generations of Fire Lords failed to find you, now the universe delivers you to me as an act of providence.
Please listen to me. We don't have to fight. You have the power to end it here and stop what you're doing.
So here we have one of the few instances of dialogue for this scene, and while being short, it gives plenty of great information. Remember, we have already talked about how this scene is constructed as its own fully fledged story with 3 acts. Well, like any story, there not only needs to be characters, the audience needs to be given information on those characters. This short exchange of dialogue works fantastically to establish clear character details and goals. Let's listen to what Ozai says one more time.
After generations of Fire Lords failed to find you, now the universe delivers you to me as an act of providence.
Ozai's line provides a lot of context into his mindset as a character. He literally believes that conquering the world is his destiny, and that killing the Avatar is sanctioned by fate. Even if you knew nothing else about Avatar: The Last Airbender as a show, this one line from Ozai paints a perfect picture of how maniacal and deluded he is. He revels in the opportunity to murder a child. With this line, the antagonist of this self-contained story is set. Now, let's look at Aang's dialogue.
Please listen to me. We don't have to fight. You have the power to end it here and stop what you're doing.
Again, more great information that provides character insight. Aang offering Ozai a chance to peacefully resolve the war tells the audience everything they would need to know about his character. These short few lines of dialogue cement the morality and goals of both of the characters without such information ever needing to be blatantly stated. Aang didn't have to call Fire Lord Ozai evil. Aang didn't have to call himself the savior of the world. Any watcher of this scene could come to those proper conclusions on their own because of the way that the dialogue showed the characters occupying those roles. And the icing on the cake is that the character details established by this dialogue is reflected in how each of these characters battle. Ozai fights with palpable murderous intent. Aang fights like a person who's doing everything in their power not to kill. This short exchange of dialogue also happens to be the last moments of the introduction, and transitions us into the midsection with rising action. Okay, in that last clip, we saw Aang use all 4 elements. On the surface, that might appear just as a cool sequence to keep the fight varied and interesting, which on some level it was. But Aang's use of all 4 elements during this fight is actually pretty important for the narrative. During the climax of any fiction, the protagonist is faced with overcoming the conflict. That is what makes it a climax. In a well-structured narrative, the protagonist utilizes the skills and tools they have cultivated over the course of the story to surmount the conflict. But why is that? Well, across a story, the protagonist is meant to change. That change can come in the form of a moral lesson, or a learned physical skill, or anything in between, but the significant part to keep in mind is that whatever change occurred in the protagonist is meant to make them more prepared to face the conflict than when they started. That change, also known as a character journey, is meant to directly affect how the protagonist overcomes the conflict. By understanding this, we get a sense of why Aang and Ozai's battle is happening on this terrain. Avatar had a very simple premise based around character growth. Aang had to learn all 4 elements to become a fully realized avatar. And that's pretty much what he did. So to validate that journey on a narrative level, the writers decided to give Aang access to all 4 elements during his confrontation with Ozai. By doing this, Aang's entire journey of learning each of these elements directly contributes to overcoming the conflict. And just in case you need it explained a tad bit more simply, think of it like this. If Aang were to have faced Ozai just using airbending, it would have invalidated all that time and effort used to learn the other elements. The battle terrain being filled with rocky spires and waterfalls is a writing choice that gives Aang access to all of the elements, and one that allows him to make use of all parts of his narrative journey. And if you are currently on your narrative journey of being a writer or even just a consumer of fiction, you should definitely check out Skillshare. Learning about character roles, narrative themes, tone, and conflict took me years, and I did it by learning from knowledgeable writers like the people on Skillshare. Like I said before, understanding the intricate writing aspects of The Last Airbender has only deepened my appreciation for it, and I would argue that the same thing would happen for you. Skillshare has content on narrative conflict, character creation, and even poetry, which is how I first started out writing. The best part is Skillshare is giving away a free 2-month unlimited access trial to my subscribers who click the link in the description. And even after that, it will still be pretty cheap at about $10 a month. If you are someone who wants to improve in their craft, join 7 million other creative minds with Skillshare. So, while you're mulling that over, let's get back to the fight. This is another really cool moment. First, I want to say that this scene with the lightning coincides with what I said previously about validating narrative journeys. Since Aang spent all that time learning lightning redirection, the best writing choice would be to give him a chance to use it when overcoming the conflict. However, there is a wrinkle. This scene also does a great job of showing Aang's character. Robert McKee, who literally wrote the book on story, has said, "True character is revealed through the choices a human being makes under pressure. The greater the pressure, the deeper the revelation, and the truer the choice to the character's essential nature." Basically, when a character's back is up against the wall, that is when you find out who they really are. Here, Aang is fighting for his life against his greatest opponent thus far, and is given an opportunity to kill Ozai. And yet, Aang chooses to redirect the lightning elsewhere. This decision by Aang shows his truest, most essential nature, because he is under the most pressure one could possibly imagine, but still hangs on to his morals and values. But of course, the real wrinkle comes from what this means for the fight. Through visual storytelling, the audience now knows that Aang will not kill Ozai no matter what. Conversely, the audience knows that Ozai will definitely kill Aang given the first chance. The tension of the fight is not just about who will win. It is about how Aang will overcome Ozai even with this handicap. Now, let's fast forward a bit to the next scene of interest.
Come on out, Avatar! You can't hide in there forever!
Alright, that last bit of Ozai conjuring the fire in his hand is my favorite moment in the fight. I love it specifically because it breaks the rules of Avatar, but in a good way. Throughout the run of the series, Avatar's narrative utilized a soft magic system. This means that the rules and regulations of the magic within the world, aka the bending, were never outwardly stated or defined. Everything the audience knew about bending came from watching the characters bend and figuring out what to and to not expect. The possibilities of bending were basically only limited by the imagination of the characters. But across the series, bending has always been synonymous with martial arts. One of the only clearly defined rules of bending was that a person must be able to move their body to bend. This is why across the series, benders would be restrained to limit their threat. As long as a bender is not moving their body, they shouldn't be able to bend. And that is exactly why this moment from Ozai is so cool. Ozai firebends without moving his arms at all, and it's one of his most powerful attacks yet. On a narrative level, this signals to the audience that the threat facing the protagonist is so great that it defies the established logic of the world. Like many of the other things we have talked about, Avatar does not have a monopoly on this either. In Naruto, hand signs are meant to be done with two hands, but Haku's power was impressed upon the audience when he did hand signs with one hand.
Hand signs with a single hand? I've never seen that before.
Likewise, enemies in Bleach are only supposed to be able to transform once, but Ulquiorra's power was impressed upon the audience when he transformed twice.
I alone have found a way to achieve this second stage release.
Again, I know focusing on this no movement fire is a very minor detail, but from a narrative perspective, I think it does a lot to show just how incredibly significant of an antagonist Ozai is. Okay, so activating the Avatar state because of a lucky hit in the back is one of the very few minor flaws in this otherwise perfect fight. Now, does this detract from the awesomeness of the scene in any significant way? Absolutely not. Is it still a narrative weakness? Yes. However, I won't go into explaining it right now, because it is simply part of a larger weakness with the finale as a whole. Anyway, let's get back to it.
Come on out, little boy. You're about to be...
That couldn't have been any better. The tone of the fight completely shifted with that single action by Aang. Where Ozai previously exerted complete control over everything that was happening, Aang grabbing his goatee, swatting away his hand, and blasting him with air firmly establishes Aang as the person in control. And that's great because the activation of the Avatar state transitions us into the climax, where the conflict and stakes are at their absolute highest. Just a little bit ago, we talked about Ozai not moving to make fire, which is a narrative technique where a character breaks the rules of the fiction in order to show their power. Well, that is what's happening again here with Aang, just on a much greater level. Where Ozai broke the laws of bending, Aang breaks the laws of physics. What I mean is, Aang takes the water from the lake and then compresses it into a small swirling ring. Just so you all at home know, that is impossible. Water is considered incompressible, and even the greatest feats of modern engineering have come nowhere close to doing what Aang just did with the lake. Again, I fully recognize that this is a minuscule detail, but on a narrative level, I think this shows that Aang in this moment is as close to a god as any bender could be. Just like how Ozai needed to prove his power to be validated as the central antagonist, the Avatar state was much in the same position. All throughout the series, the audience was told that the Avatar was the most powerful being on the planet, and that the Avatar state was their most powerful tool. To validate that narrative hype, the audience had to be shown something they had never seen before. I think Aang accomplishes that well here. Let's fast forward a bit again in the fight. Aang's ascendance into the Avatar state has caused a complete tonal shift in the narrative of this scene. In fact, it almost seems like Aang is the antagonist. Well, that's because he is. Let me explain. Across this section of the fight, it becomes more and more evident that Ozai, even with Sozin's Comet, has no chance of even harming Aang. Likewise, it is becoming more evident Aang is no longer holding back. He is genuinely trying to kill the Fire Lord. These details are very significant because it changes the entire conflict of the fight. Remember, narrative conflict is defined as whatever stands in the way of a character achieving their goal. So, the battle began with Aang wanting to stop Ozai's conquest without killing him. That was Aang's goal. Ozai obviously stood in the way of that goal. Since Aang is the protagonist and Ozai stood in the way of his goal, that meant Ozai was the antagonist. But things are a bit different now. The Avatar state has taken over Aang's body and is attempting to murder Ozai. Since Aang's goal is to stop the conquest without killing Ozai, the Avatar state's murderous intent stands in Aang's way. So what that means, by definition, is that the Avatar state opposes the goal of Aang, the protagonist. This means that the Avatar state, at least in this portion of the scene, is the antagonist. The tension of the scene has switched from how will Aang defeat Ozai without killing him to will Aang be forced to murder someone against his will. The reason why the Avatar state is so terrifying to both Ozai and the audience is because it represents an opposition to the main character that we have come to love so much. We watchers are kept on the edge of our seats waiting to see what the outcome will be. It's an excellent way not only to keep the fight fresh by changing its parameters, but also add complexity to an already nuanced narrative. So, let's fast forward a bit again.
No, I'm not gonna end it like this.
So, by regaining control of himself, Aang has overcome the Avatar state as the antagonist and surpassed the conflict of killing Ozai against his will. However, that then reverts us back to the original conflict of how will Aang defeat Ozai without killing him. To get that answer though, we will have to fast forward one more time.
What did you do to me?
I took away your firebending. You can't use it to hurt or threaten anyone else ever again.
So, this stands as the resolution to the fight and the narrative of the scene. Aang has accomplished his goal by stopping Ozai's conquest without killing him. However, on my pride as an editor, I have to call things like I see them, and this sequence also represents a general flaw with this finale. In the end, Aang's ability to achieve his goal and overcome the antagonist did not come from any choices or changes that he made for himself. The circumstances that led to Aang learning energy bending were completely out of his control. He just happened to wake up on a lion turtle that could bestow upon him a power to solve his problems. This is much in the same vein as Aang gaining the upper hand against Ozai by coincidentally falling against a rock that poked his back. Another general guideline of writing is that while it's perfectly fine to get your characters into trouble by coincidence, it is problematic to get them out of trouble by coincidence. If Aang had sought out the lion turtle to be given a solution to this conflict, that would have been perfectly reasonable. But the major events that resulted in Aang overcoming the antagonist and the conflict were not earned by Aang. They were gifted by happenstance. But even with all that said, this finale to The Last Airbender was still nearly perfect. While it had narrative weaknesses, just like any story, the amount of stuff it got right more than makes up for it. Anyway, I hope you all found this video either educational, interesting, or both. I love Avatar, and doing a video on it has been a long-standing desire of mine, so this was a blast. If you like what you heard and want to support the channel, subscribe or join in on Patreon for some awesome perks. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Skillshare. As always, it was a pleasure, and I will talk to you all again soon.